Today we're going to talk all about watercolor paint. Watercolor paint is like a staple in every elementary art classroom, and every elementary classroom and beyond. Everybody loves watercolor paint, but they can be a little bit of a challenge unless you have these tips that I'm going to share with you today. I think I've got like 10, maybe 12 tips to share with you. Regardless, it's a lot, and I'm hoping that it makes your watercolor painting life with kids a whole bunch easier. But before we get started, I'm a little bit of a collector. I don't know if the background told you that or not, or if you just know me a little bit, then you know that I like my stuff. I'm very stuffy. And I happen to have quite the collection of watercolor paint from days old watercolor paint, vintage watercolor paint sets. I'll share them with you. First of all, we have my absolute favorite, this watercolor paint set from England. Isn't it amazing? I mean, the artwork alone is so stinking cute, but wait until you see the colors inside. Look, some are missing, but look at all of those choices. We've got light blue, burnt sienna, leaf green, buff. Are they talking about me? Yellow lake. I'm not swimming in a yellow lake. I'm gonna be really honest with you. I love this set because of the art on the cover. That this one looks pretty well loved. I also love the kind of classic look of this one. Let's see what the inside looks like. Oh, there went the paintbrush. This is primary yellow. This pretty much looks like every art teacher's watercolor set, right? Am I right? Am I right? I'm glad to know that way back when kids were still doing this to their yellow. Okay, tip number 1, get rid of the case. Now, you don't have to throw it away. You can save it, decorate with it, do whatever you want, but I take my watercolor out of the case. And the reason is, there's a couple of reasons. Reason number 1 is I often notice that students ideally are meant to use this side of the case for mixing their own colors and whatever dream, some vision, some person who is not an art teacher, who's not been around children, who doesn't know their destructive nature, intended for this to be some sort of palette for them. All fine and wonderful in theory, but what I have found is that it just becomes a place that gets all mixed up and yucky with paint that I later on have to clean, which, side tip, if you do need to clean all these out, dishwasher man, throw it in the dishwasher. And the other reason I don't like having these is because in between use, you need your watercolor trays to dry out so that they don't stay really sticky and gooey and damp. But if you leave them in the case and close the lid, they are never going to dry. Or worse yet, I don't know, they could mold. So I get rid of these cases, save them for when you do need palettes with your students. But for me, with watercolor paint, these don't work. Tip number 2 is that there are certain colors that you might want to remove from your paint tray like immediately, especially if your students are tending to mix up and muck up your paint trays. And that would be black, brown, and white. Why is there white in the watercolor tray? Like the paper is white. Anyway, the reason I say remove those colors is because what I have found is that immediately black and brown, the darkest colors on the tray, along with purple, can oftentimes contaminate all of the other colors. I don't know if you know this, but apparently kids are secretly emo and they want to paint everything very, very dark and black, including your paint trays. And that means you're going to spend a lot of time trying to clean out each one of these colors. Y'all, don't waste your time on that headache. Remove those colors from your paint tray. Also, the white is just going to end up getting filthy, dirty, and nasty. So out they go. Then you can always bring back those colors when you are painting something specific that requires those colors. So keep them on hand, but when it comes to just watercolor painting in general, you might want to consider taking them out. Tip number 3, customize your very own watercolor trays. Now that you've removed some of those colors, you may want to create watercolor trays specific to whatever projects you're going to be working on. So for me, that means I create 3 different sets of watercolor trays, and that means I usually have 1 set per 2 students. So if I have a classroom of 20 kids, then I usually have about 10 sets of each different assortment I'm going to share with you. So first one being a rainbow assortment. So I have created 10 of these rainbow assortments for my students. And in the rainbow assortment, I have magenta, red, red-orange, yellow, green, turquoise, blue, and violet. So that is what is in my rainbow set. The other two customized trays that I have are a warm color tray and a cool color tray. And I have 10 of each. And the reason I have two separate trays is because if these colors get mixed up on a student's work of art, or even in the paint tray, since these colors are analogous, meaning they sit next to each other on the color wheel, if they're mixed up, the colors don't muddy and they still look beautiful. When there are times where students are given the opportunity to use both, that's when we use our rainbow assortment. Here's the colors that I have in my warm color paint tray. Red, red-orange, orange, and yellow. My cool color paint tray, magenta, again, because magenta to me is a color that could either be warm or could either be cool, and it blends really beautifully with either set of colors. Turquoise, blue, and green. Another customized tray that you could make is one that is for mixing beautiful flesh tones. So on a flesh tone palette, I have black, brown, red, orange, yellow, and white. All that to say, if you're going to be using watercolor paint and you want to customize, then make sure you hang on to these guys. When you are passing out watercolor paint or having your students come and gather their own art supplies, might I recommend you have everything on a tray. A tray makes distributing watercolor paint a whole lot easier, but my favorite thing is it helps to capture the mess. On your watercolor tray, you've got your palette. You then also should have some sort of cup of water, and I also like to have a sponge. And for me, a dog dish is how I can have both of those things in one compartment. It makes my life a whole lot easier. Wake up juice. So when my students are off gathering their paper and their paintbrushes, I walk around the room with a little something that I call wake up juice. Wake up juice is simply water that I spray on their watercolor paint. And the reason I do that is because then the watercolor paint is ready for them to use immediately. So as soon as they get to their seat, write their name and teacher code on their paper, flip their paper over, and after I've sprayed it, they are good to go. And as my students are working, if their paint starts to feel a little sticky or a little bit dry, I've showed them how to just add a little drop of water from their water dish to their paint, or they can simply raise their hand, let me know, and I'll come back by with my wake up juice. Now for my older students, I just keep wake up juice out on my counter so that they can independently go and grab it and then spray down their watercolor tray. When it comes to painting, there is nothing worse than seeing kids dig the paint out of a watercolor tray. So here's a couple of things that I tell them when they are watercolor painting. Thing number one, you've probably heard me say this before, is your paintbrush is like a ballerina. A ballerina brush should always be on its toes. Never ever should a ballerina paintbrush scooting around on its bottom like this, thusly ruining the paintbrushes and the paint. Oh, poor little brush. So for that reason, what I always tell them is their paintbrush should always be kind of dancing like a ballerina on its toes in their paint and on their paper. But sometimes that doesn't help for them to get paint by just swirling around. So oftentimes what I'll tell them is that when they are getting their paint from their tray, they should be petting their paint gently, like you would pet a kitten. Now when it comes to cleaning their brush, I tell them to put their paintbrush in the paintbrush bathtub, swirl it around and give a gentle scrub, meaning put your brush all the way at the base of the cup and you should hear it scratching. And then when you take it out so that it's clean thoroughly, draw an X on this sponge, whom we call dirty old SpongeBob. Now, the deal is, though, with watercolor paint, you want the paint to always stay saturated. And my brush, once drawing an X on SpongeBob, is now a little bit dry. So when it comes to watercolor paint, your brush has to get a little drink of water before going and getting a new color. So wash, X, drink of water, paint. Now, when you're introducing watercolor paint to your students, it's important to explain to them the difference between translucent and opaque, because a lot of them have probably used something like tempera paint, whether it be tempera cakes or liquid tempera paint before. So they understand that a paint is really supposed to cover the surface of their paper. So they might be kind of like thrown a little bit, or they may try to accomplish that same look with watercolor paint. And that's when they start digging into that paint and putting it on really thickly. So when you're introducing it to your students, be sure to really talk to them about the difference between translucent and opaque. So you can take these guys that have just a little bit of paint left in them and put them in something like a mason jar or a spray bottle, all of the like colors going into one bottle, and then keep them in here with about a little bit of water, just depending on how diluted you want it to be. If you put it in a spray bottle, next thing you know, you've got kind of a nice liquid watercolor that your students can use as a spray, or if you put it in a mason jar, then you can really pour it out into condiment cups and distribute it to students as a liquid watercolor. When your students are finished with watercolor paint, again, make sure these trays sit out and you allow them to dry thoroughly. So to do that, I usually have my students have their watercolor paint on a tray. It can be the same tray as I used before or something like this. This one's a little bit smaller because it'll fit easily in the contraption I'm about to show you. And then my students have this guy sitting on the counter. So it's a file holder that I have turned this way. And then my students just slide their watercolor trays onto that. And that allows all of them to be spaced out. They're allowed to dry. And when we use them again, we can just take this guy out. So there you have it, a whole bunch of watercolor paint hacks. I think that was maybe 10, I don't know, I lost count. I just hope that there was something in there for you that you can use that'll make watercolor painting with children a whole lot easier. And if you're curious about what supplies I like to use, you can always check down below. And there are tons of videos here on my YouTube channel showing me introducing a lot of those tips and tricks and techniques that I shared with you to my students. So if you're curious, you might want to check the playlist called Art Teacher in 101 or the playlist called A Glimpse Inside. Thanks, guys.